This is part 6 of an 8-part series on the meanings of the prophecies in the book of Daniel. In chapter 10 we were introduced to the man from heaven who then in this chapter 11 proceeds to reveal a vision to Daniel. This vision in chapter 11 is in 2 sections. The first section is about the kings of the south and the north. Then in the second section the man foretells the coming of a king who exalts himself. Why should we care about these visions? After all, the meanings of the kings of the south and north section that opens chapter 11 has been known for centuries, and those events occurred long ago. Nothing new here. However, you should be aware that the second section, the king who exalts himself, although this king has already been here and gone, what those events signified has not been understood until now. And this video will reveal those meanings to you. Stay here with me to learn the identity of the king who exalted himself and how that sign of the times, that's the time period of the fall of this king, was telling us the time period when the Messiah of the latter days would appear on this earth. The area of the world that this king who exalted himself unsuccessfully invaded also shows us what the location would be of the major portion of the lifetime of the Messiah of the latter days. This is the 6th part of an 8-part series. The yellow arrow should indicate that it is indeed the 6th. And it is important that you see all of them, and I really emphasize to people that you should start with part 1 and see each part in sequence. If you have not done so, I'd recommend you go back and start with part 1. Some of the videos are quite lengthy. I would recommend, for your own sanity, that you watch a video for as long as you can comfortably and pay attention, and then note down the time marker on the video that you stopped watching that day, and then pick it up another day so that you don't overdose on these videos. They are lectures, they are not light entertainment. And this is the website you can go to access my channel, to have access to these other videos. You go to youtube.com, and my channel name is Integral Destiny 9 that you put into the search box, and you should have access to my videos from there. So here we are at the explanation of the meanings of the prophecies in chapter 11. This video is divided into 2 parts. The Kings of the South and North section, which is the first part of chapter 11. We will only be doing a brief review of that section 1 in this video. The detailed explanation is in part 8. That's the last video in this series on the book of Daniel. The second section is the king who exalts himself, which I'll be concentrating on this very interesting and important prophecy, its fulfillment and its meaning, which has been hidden until now. We start out on section 1 on the kings of the south and north. These images from Wikipedia show some of those kings, not all, but some of the kings we'll be discussing, but not in detail here, where that will be in part number 8 of the series for a detailed accounting. On the left, Alexander the Great. Below that is a rendition of Seleucus I, one of Alexander's generals who became king and founder of the Seleucid Empire. Upper right, an image of Antiochus IV of the Seleucid Empire, and bottom right is a scene depicting Ptolemy I of the Ptolemaic Empire conquering Jerusalem around 320 BC. First, we have to do a little brief review of chapter 10 as a preface to these last 2 chapters of Daniel. Chapter 10 was about Daniel's vision of the man that Daniel saw in the vision, who was standing by the Tigris River. The man tells Daniel about the coming of a great war. That's in Daniel chapter 10 verse 1. Chapter 10 ends with the man stating that the prince from Greece was coming. That's in Daniel chapter 10 verse 20. And remember, we now know that the man that Daniel saw was the Bab, which in English means the gate. The Bab would prove to be the Elijah figure to the Messiah of the second advent expected in the latter days. The Bab, meaning the man Daniel saw, was coming to Daniel from the future. The Bab, the man, was delayed in getting to tell this information to Daniel because he was resisted by the Prince of Persia sometime in the future. We also know this time in the future was around the years 1844 to 1850 because that was the time that was prophesied in chapter 8 of Daniel that the Messiah and his Elijah would appear. This period was also when the Bab was on earth, unveiling his revelation from God as the Elijah to the Messiah. We also know that this Prince of Greece, who was coming to the area of the Tigris River, the area of Babylon, was Alexander the Great. Review video number 4 on chapter 8 to learn about Alexander the Great's conquering of this area of the world, which could also be the Great War that the man said was coming, although I believe that the man was foretelling that the Great War was to be a spiritual war that would last into the latter days. In chapter 11, the first section of stories of the kings of the south and north and how they vie for power are in verses 5 through 35. The last one of those kings of the north in the first part of chapter 11 to be described was Antiochus IV of the Seleucid Persian Empire. This is known history. Others have already identified Alexander the Great, Seleucus, Antiochus IV as meeting the criteria of the prophecies in Daniel chapter 11. A question: do any of these past prophecies that have already been fulfilled matter in this presentation? After all, my purpose is to reveal how the prophecies of the coming of the Messiah of the second advent were in these chapters of Daniel. The section of chapter 11 about the kings of the north and south were fulfilled long ago, just as Daniel foretold, proving his visions were true. But it is important to remember, this war between the king of the north, Antiochus IV, and the king of the south, Ptolemy, put Antiochus IV in place as the emperor over the Jewish people. His actions against the Jews, Jewish traditions and laws and religious practices resulted in one of the episodes of desolation to the Jewish people that have been described in Jewish scripture and lore and mentioned in this chapter of Daniel. These events in verses 5 through 34 all led up to the Maccabean revolt and thus the quasi-independence of Judea, but which ultimately was nullified by the Roman Empire conquering that area in 63 BC. This set up the circumstances for the arrival of the Messiah of the first advent, Jesus the Christ. And also remember that, as with all the other prophecies in the book of Daniel, the prophecies in chapters 11 and 12 are foretelling events that occurred or will occur in the territory of the former Neo-Babylonian Empire of King Nebuchadnezzar's time. Now, some may question whether the prophecies about the kings of the south and the north were even prophecies. The copies of the book of Daniel, 8 of them, found with the Dead Sea Scrolls were scientifically dated as being written around 135 BC. That is the dating of the ink and paper of the copies. Yet the events of chapter 11 from Alexander the Great to Antiochus IV occurred from 334 BC to 164 BC, the year of the death of Antiochus. This timeline shows the time of Daniel on the left. See the arrow pointing to the period shown to be the theorized lifetime of Daniel, in relation to when the presumed prophecy-fulfilling events of the kings of the north and south prophecies occurred. To the right are the lifetimes of Alexander the Great from about 356 to 323 BC. He was only 33 when he died. He died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, by the way. And Seleucus I, who founded the Seleucid Empire, he lived from about 358 to 281 BC. And on the far right of the timeline is the lifetime of Antiochus IV, who lived from about 215 to 164 BC. The yellow star in the lower right corner at 135 BC is the scientifically determined date of the scrolls of the Book of Daniel found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Note that these were all copies that were found, not any originals. Experts agree that there must be an older original Book of Daniel because linguistically the language in these copies had far older language patterns and usages, not in use when the copies were copied. So we can see that the date of the copies of Daniel were after the events of the first set of kings of the north and south mentioned in chapter 11 verses 5 through 35. At least the interpretation that most people have had, that these events were the fulfillment of Daniel verses 5 to 34. So we can visually see that it would be possible that chapter 11 verses 5 to 35 could have been added to the original book of Daniel, meaning that they were not prophecies but rather were recorded history stories at the time the copies of Daniel were made. So, prophecy or history? As said, it appears that verses 5 through 35 could have been added to the book of Daniel after the events of these known kings actually happened. Or it could well be that Daniel's prophecies were there from the time of Daniel, and actual events fulfilled these prophecies precisely. There is a third possibility, that the events in Daniel in the first section of chapter 11 have a completely different interpretation, a different way they were fulfilled, and I do believe they would have had to have been fulfilled in a way we do not yet have the ability to pinpoint. Maybe someone could research the history of the time since Daniel to this day to see if there are other events that match these prophecies. If we do use these kings, the kings of the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire, as those kings of the north and south respectively, then we will really never know if this was prophecy or history unless we find the original text of the book of Daniel and can date it, or a much older copy that is dated before the times of these kings. The meanings of verses 5 through 35 is all past history. Then with that open question about whether verses 5 to 35 were original to Daniel or added later, and that those verses are not pertinent to what we are talking about here, the prophecies of the coming of the Messiah of the latter days, to save time and space and boredom, I will not go through them here. For those of you who are curious about these verses, I'll put the explanation in video number 8 of this video series. It's an addendum to the main chapters that are reviewed in the first 7 videos. So you'd have to go to video or part number 8 of the book of Daniel. We do have to wonder what the significance of these prophecies, if they really are prophecies, would be. If the prophecies of the kings of the north and south in those verses are truly from Daniel, they pointed to the approximate time they would have been fulfilled, meaning that they're time prophecies. Why? Because it would tell, along with chapter 9, the approaching time of the coming of the Messiah of the first advent, Jesus. Actual history indicates that Antiochus IV was probably the last king to be specifically mentioned in Daniel verses 5 to 35, the king who caused Jewish religious beliefs to be made illegal, thus causing desolation of the host, the Jews. Briefly after the Maccabean revolt, the Jews were independent again, but that did not last very long, about 100 years. Rome invaded and made the beautiful land, Judea, to once again be subjugated by another nation. That's 63 BC. Judea was absorbed by the Roman Empire. This vision of the kings of the north and south is setting up God's plan. All this history of kings and conquests led up to the circumstances of the appearance of the Messiah of the first advent, Jesus, and his Elijah figure, John the Baptist. Chapter 11, prophesied events, are time indicators. Thus they are signs of the times that Jesus mentioned for which his followers should watch. The purpose of the remaining verses, 36 to 45, about the king who exalts himself is the same, only this time they are signs of the times for the advent of the Messiah of the latter days. To be clear, what I'm saying is that in the second section of chapter 11, the actions and times of the king who exalts himself indicates the setting up of the appearances of the Messiah of the second advent and his Elijah figure. The second advent of the Messiah is in the latter days. Verse 35 of chapter 11 sets us up to understand the time that the remaining events of chapter 11 after verse 35 will occur. Quote, "Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will come at the appointed time." End quote. There's this phrase of that verse 35, quote, "Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless." End quote. This is a very short, concise way of saying that lots of events, tests, trials, and hard times will occur over a long period of time so that humanity will be refined to prepare them for the second advent of the Messiah, which will come at the end of the period of the king of the second part of chapter 11, the king who exalted himself. Then this part of the verse states, quote, "Until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time." End quote. This tells us that time has passed until the time of the end is at hand for the remaining prophecies in this chapter. It is telling us that the next verses to follow, verses 36 to the end of chapter 11, the story of the king who exalts himself, meaning that this king who exalts himself will come near the start of the time of the end, as an indicator that the time was at hand, a sign of the times. Remember, Jesus warned his followers to watch for the signs of the time. And just to verify that we are talking about the end times, or the latter days, we're going to jump ahead here to verse 40, just a couple verses ahead of us. Quote, "At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood." End quote. Most would say that they don't know when the end times or the latter days will be. But the Zohar knows. What is the Zohar? Per Wikipedia, the Zohar is a group of books, including commentary, on the mystical aspects of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and scriptural interpretations, as well as material on mysticism, mythical cosmogony, having to do with the cosmos, and mystical psychology. The Zohar contains a discussion on the nature of God, the origin and structure of the universe, the nature of souls, redemption, the relationship of ego to darkness, and true self to the light of God, and the relationship between the universal energy and man. Its scriptural exegesis can be considered an esoteric form of the rabbinic literature known as the Midrash, which elaborates on the Torah. You can read the Zohar at this website, zohar.com. You will have to register on the site to access it, but it is free. This website describes the Zohar as follows, quote, "Revealed more than 2,000 years ago, the Zohar is a spiritual text that explains the secrets of the Bible, the universe, and every aspect of life." End quote. The Zohar has 23 books, each having several chapters. Each chapter has multiple numbered articles on various topics within it. Here's an example. The book titled Vayera has 38 chapters, including these two you see there, number 32 and number 34. 32 is the reckoning of the Messianic era, and number 34 is the signs heralding Messiah. Note that this book, Vayera, and chapters 32 and 34 play a big part in knowing when the Messiah is to come and the start of the 7th millennium. More about this shortly. Concerning the latter days, the beginning of it is somewhere around that 1844 Common Era date that the 2300-day prophecy in chapter 8 of Daniel gave us. But the definitive answer is found in the Jewish 7th millennium prophecy in their mystical writings known as the Zohar. The Zohar states that the Messiah is to come after the 600th year of the 6th millennium. The latter days thus began around that 600th year of that 6th millennium, the period between the 600th year of the 6th millennium and the start of the 7th sabbatical millennium. The 6th millennium started in the year 1240 Common Era, 775 years ago. The 600th year then was 1840 Common Era, the approximate start of the latter days. This slide shows the full timeline of the 7 millenniums. The vertical line at the far left is the year 1 of the Jewish calendar. Note that this timeline can be used whether you believe in a 6,000-year-old Earth or a 4.5 billion-year-old Earth. This 7 millennium timeline can be considered as just a 7,000-year portion of a much longer timeline if you believe in an older Earth, as I do. Each day on the timeline is equivalent to 1,000 years. On the right are the 6th and 7th millenniums. The red arrow near the lower right corner shows when the Messiah of the Second Advent, Baha'u'llah, appeared. The blue shaded area is the approximate time span of the latter days, end times, last days, whatever you choose to call it. The last 400 years at the end of the 6th millennium is when the world is being prepared to accept the new Messiah and greet the 7th sabbatical millennium, meaning the last days before the 7th millennium, during which the Messiah would return. At this point, most of the world is not even aware of his coming. God is giving us some time to get the gears in motion to welcome the full impact of that 7th millennium. Note that the period of the latter days has fuzzy boundaries in time, as shown by the dotted pink lines on the timeline. Approximately from the year 1840 Common Era to 2240 Common Era. The spiritual power of the appearances of the forerunner and the Messiah on earth begins to be felt before that year 1840, just as it will still have effects into the 7th millennium itself. Baha'u'llah was born in 1817 and the Bab in 1819. Their births have an effect even before they actually announced their identities and the purposes. Obviously, this means that we are in the latter days of the 6th millennium, the last 400 years of the 6th millennium. There are about 225 more years until the start of the 7th millennium in the year 2240 Common Era. Note that the full details of the prophecy I call the prophecy of the 7th millennium are covered in my video by that title. Just go to youtube.com, and put my channel name, Integral Destiny 9, into the search box and look for my video by that title. The clues from the Zohar and Daniel chapter 8 set the approximate start of the latter days around the time frame of 1800 to 1840 Common Era or so. The plan for our task here of explaining how the prophecies regarding this king who exalted himself were fulfilled will be in 3 phases. First, I'll do a run-through of verses 36 through 45. That's only 10 verses. It shouldn't be so bad. Then after that, we'll identify who this king was and give a brief history of this king. Then third, we'll repeat those verses, but we'll zero in on giving an explanation of how this king fulfilled those verses. Here we commence with that first review of verses 36 to 45 of chapter 11 of Daniel. Note that quotes from the Bible will have a yellow background. Verse 36, quote, "The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his ancestors. He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god, and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people, and will distribute the land at a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Cushites in submission. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him." End quote, and end of chapter 11. We have many clues to help us pinpoint who this king who exalted himself was within, let's say, the 1700s through the 1800s, with likely occurrence closer to the 1800 to the 1840s time frame, because that's when the latter days kind of began. Again, the purpose of this whole prophecy about the king who exalts himself is that finding this king will help us pinpoint the time period when Michael and Gabriel, that's Gabriel the man Daniel saw by the Tigris River, would appear, thus point us to when the Messiah and his Elijah would appear. And also, it also serves to verify other prophecies of this same time period that we've discussed in other videos of on the book of Daniel, as well as my other videos on Bible prophecy fulfillment. All these prophecies are interrelated and help confirm each other, so that it's a little hard, or actually very hard, to escape the fact that these prophecies have truly been fulfilled by the Bab and Baha'u'llah. So who was this mystery man, this king who exalted himself? Did he show up when Daniel said sometime before 1844, the date pinpointed in Daniel chapter 8 as the year of the return of the Messiah? Did he meet all the criteria Daniel gave that would firmly indicate he truly is this king who exalted himself? The big reveal: it was Napoleon Bonaparte who was this king who exalted himself. And yes, Napoleon Bonaparte quite famously invaded Egypt and Palestine, the beautiful land that Daniel foretold. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, Napoleon was not a king when he conquered Egypt. He was a general in charge of an army. Well, after he conquered Egypt, he set himself up as the ruler of it. He immediately sent out edicts to reform the design of governance and many functions of it. He became a de facto de facto self-declared king of Egypt. And like in any other case, a conqueror of a head of an army like Alexander the Great conquers a land, he sets himself up as the king of it. So in effect, Napoleon was indeed a king. Napoleon was born on August 15th, 1769 on the French island of Corsica. His family moved there from Italy a couple hundred years before Napoleon was born. His family was one of the landed upper class, but Corsica was not a wealthy land. There was not a large gap between the rich and the poor on the island. Being considered of noble birth or minimally of the upper class, Napoleon was educated in military schools from childhood. He was raised in the culture of the military. His heroes were Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Napoleon was 20 years old when the Bastille was stormed by angry mobs on July 14, 1789, and the French Revolution began. Napoleon had a convoluted path in both the Corsican National Guard and the French army. At one point he had deserted the French army. He took a medical leave for unknown reasons, then went back to Corsica and got involved with politics and the military there, and just did not bother to go back on the date he was due. But with the French Revolution ongoing, he wangled away to return as a captain in the French army in July of 1792 at the age of 23. About a year and a half later, on December 22nd, 1793, he was appointed as a brigadier general and inspector of coastal defenses from the Rhone to the Var at age 24. He had major ups and downs in his military career until, in October 1795, the third constitution since the fall of the Bastille was approved. Factions pro and con began to prepare to overthrow the government. Napoleon was appointed to defend the president in the National Assembly. He fired upon French citizens who were descending upon the National Assembly. 300 insurrectionists were killed. 6 of Napoleon's army were killed. Napoleon was promoted and his pay increased. Napoleon was, in effect, rewarded for callous behavior. He massacred 300 French citizens. Napoleon was quoted as saying at one time in regard to putting down insurrections, quote, "Bloodletting is among the ingredients of political medicine," end quote. This, among many other of his actions, and in letters and other documents he wrote, is a clear confirmation of a very cold view of the value of life. From what I have read, he seemed pathological on this regard, but then so many of the other commanders of other armies were quite similar. A further reward to Napoleon for his saving the leadership of France by putting down that insurrection was that he was given command of the Army of Italy, that was the French Army Corps by that name, on March 2nd, 1796. The purpose of his assignment was to push back the Austrian army that was in the northern part of Italy approaching the French border. Also, the Italian kingdom of Piedmont had declared war on France. Several European nations had declared war on France around 1793 with the intent of putting an end to the French Revolution and reinstalling a monarchy in France. Once Napoleon won over Austrian and Italian troops and France became the ruler of these territories, he required of the conquered territories contributions from the nobles. Napoleon used this tribute to pay his soldiers, sent some of it back to Paris, but there were some reports that more was collected than spent for those costs, meaning Napoleon may have pocketed some of the money. Some of these contributions were artwork from the estates of these nobles and were sent to a museum in Paris, later called the Louvre. Napoleon had a habit of fudging the number of deaths of French soldiers, the number of injured, and the number of enemy troops that were killed throughout his military career, and this fudging of numbers was quite significant. He went well beyond his orders by entering into agreements with noble or government leaders. He ruled the territories, changing many policies and laws, including eliminating unjust treatment of non-Catholics and Jews. French troops entered the Papal States in June of 1796. Napoleon attempted to reduce the power of the papacy in Italy, but was not successful. He did require tribute from the Pope of 1.5 million francs. With Napoleon's victories in Italy, the leaders in France, called the Directory, had some new plans for Napoleon's abilities. They assigned him to invade Egypt. He was given anything he said he needed to accomplish this. The purposes behind the Directory doing this included: France would gain control of Egypt and trade routes to the Middle East and China. It'd be setting up French rule of Egypt and would reduce the influence of Britain in the area. And if Napoleon failed, it would ruin Napoleon's reputation in France, which would reduce his political power there. Napoleon was well known to be extremely ambitious. Napoleon in Egypt is a tale of military conquest, scientific and archaeological research, and plunder, and eventually failure. Napoleon once said that, quote, "Egypt is the geographical key to the world," end quote. Obviously, from his writings and sayings, he had bigger plans of conquest even before he invaded Egypt. The French Navy and Army forces that gathered to go to Egypt included, the French Navy under Admiral Brueys were 10,000 sailors on 400 ships that included 13 battleships, 42 frigates, and 130 transport ships. And then 38,000 troops, both cavalry and infantry. Napoleon took 167 academic and philosophy learned people, referred to as les savants, or scholars, with him, such as those you see listed here. Note that antiquity specialists that he took with him began the whole field of study called Egyptology, and furthered the development of archaeology as a science. The finding of the Rosetta Stone by these scholars allowed the Egyptian hieroglyphs to be deciphered. This map shows the ships of Admiral Brueys of France arriving offshore of Alexandria, Egypt on July 1st, 1798. The French troops took Alexandria the next day. On July 7th, Napoleon and his troops set off to Cairo, 150 miles away through the desert. Next, we're going to go through a couple timelines to point out some major events and actions by Napoleon and his forces, first in Egypt and Palestine, then thereafter. This is showing events in 1798. May 19th of 1798, the Egypt campaign begins. July 21st, Napoleon's forces wins the Battle of the Pyramids against the Mamluks, the rulers of Egypt. July 24th, Cairo falls to Napoleon. August 2nd, the British fleet destroys the French fleet near Alexandria. The French army is cut off from supplies. So now in 1799, Napoleon now rules Egypt. To pay his army, he enforces taxes and tribute from the Egyptian people. In early 1799, he gets some news that things are not going well for the French forces in Europe. England and Austria are still trying to force the cause to end the new French Republic and reinstate the monarchy. But Napoleon also hears that the Mamluk forces that he chased out of Egypt were amassing troops with the Ottoman Empire to attack and try to recapture Egypt from France. Napoleon sets off from Cairo on February 10th with the intent to conquer Acre in Palestine, where many of the Ottoman troops of Jazar Pasha, governor of Palestine, are centered. On February 25th, Jaffa falls to Napoleon. I'll show you a map shortly. On March 18th, Napoleon's headquarters is set up on Mount Carmel. He watches the British Navy overtake and take possession of many of his supply ships, including artillery guns. On March 19th, Napoleon begins the 2-month siege of Acre, at which he will fail ultimately. 1799 continued. In early May, the British Commodore Sidney Smith, he's the admiral who confiscated Napoleon's supply ships in the Mediterranean Sea in the Haifa Bay off of the city of Acre. Anyway, the British Commodore Sidney Smith sent Napoleon some newspapers from Europe that informed him that the French forces in Europe continued to lose ground in battles there. May 20th, Napoleon begins the retreat from Acre. June 14th, he re-entered Cairo. August 22nd, Napoleon left Egypt for France to assist French army efforts in Europe. Note that he left Egypt without orders from the French Directory. Most of his own officers and troops did not even know of his leaving until after the fact. Now this timeline is more condensed. It starts at 1798 and goes through the early 1800s here. The period of the Egypt campaign is shown in the blue brackets on the left. Now at the end of 1799, once Napoleon returned to Paris, on November 10th of that year, he overthrew the Directory, the governing body of the French Republic. On December 12, Napoleon was elected the first consul of the consulate. The following years, Napoleon rules, which he very much likes to do. On this timeline, we start with the year 1804 on the left. Napoleon is proclaimed as the emperor by the Senate in May. December 2nd of that year, Napoleon crowns himself as emperor. He even had the Pope brought in from Italy to crown him. The following years, 1805 to 1809, there were about 2 to 4 battles per year that the French army fought under Napoleon as emperor. 1810 and 1811 were fairly quiet as battles go. But then there were 4 battles in 1812, then a whopping 26 in 1813 as Britain and Austria rise up again against him. April 4th of 1814, Napoleon abdicates the first time and is exiled to the island of Elba off the coast of Italy on May 4th, 1814. Continuing with year 1815 on the left, on February 20th, 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba and returned to France. By March 20th, he arrived in Paris. June 18th, the Battle of Waterloo was fought and the British won. June 28th, 10 days later, King Louis XVIII is restored to the French throne by the British. October 16, Napoleon is exiled to St. Helena, an island off the coast of Africa. 6 years after being banished to St. Helena, in 1821, on May 5th, Napoleon died of stomach cancer, just short of 52 years of age. Now we're going to discuss more specifically Napoleon's campaign into Palestine, which is actually called the Acre campaign because that was his goal, to reach the city of Acre along the coast of the Mediterranean. Now some of the versions of the name Acre include Akka, Akko spelled with C's, or Akko spelled with K's, that's the Hebrew name and the present name, and of course Acre. The French term Acre comes from, supposedly, Saint Jean d'Acre, named by the Crusaders who used the fort for their purposes. Acre is a fortified city. It has been used by a variety of conquerors and inhabitants, from barracks for troops to a prison city as it became in the 1800s. The Akko or Akka names pre-existed by centuries, possibly millennia, the name Acre. Akka is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, dating back to the time of the pharaoh Thutmose III, that's 1504 to 1450 BC. there was a long history of battles centered on Acca, including it being a prime location of the Crusaders between 1095 through 1291 Common Era. Acre or Acca is located on the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea in northern Palestine, as it was then called. Now, of course, it's northern Israel. This map shows where it is located on the left in relation to other parts of the Middle East. Then the enlargement on the right shows northern Palestine, modern Israel. Note the location of Haifa and Mount Carmel. Haifa is partially on Mount Carmel. Acca is across Haifa Bay from the city of Haifa. And also remember that, as with all the other prophecies in the book of Daniel, the prophecies in chapters 11 and 12 are foretelling events in the territory of the former Neo-Babylonian Empire of King Nebuchadnezzar's time, which is, of course, the darker shaded blue here, and the arrow is pointing to where Acca is located within the old Neo-Babylonian Empire. Now I'll cover specifically how Napoleon was that prophesied king who exalts himself. This painting of Napoleon is one of the 36 portraits Napoleon ordered for his offices after he became emperor. Only 26 were completed. His arm is outstretched over his Code Napoleon that he implemented to standardize the laws of his empire. He was obviously very proud of that achievement. We will review how Napoleon, his life and actions compare to verses 36 through 45 of chapter 11 to show how he fulfilled this prophecy. So we're going back to start at the beginning of that section about the king who exalts himself, but this time we'll be comparing it to Napoleon and answer whether he fits the description in the verses. So verse 36, quote, "The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place." End quote. First, let's look at that clause that this king will do as he pleases. Lots of people do as they please. No denying that Napoleon was one such person who did as he pleased. Numerous events show he did not believe laws and regulations applied to him. But this is not a definitive characteristic of Napoleon alone. Some examples showing Napoleon's disregard for rules, his doing as he pleased, are: he left the French army on a medical leave and did not return by the date specified. He was officially dropped from the army. He eventually went back, and because the revolution created problems tracking such events, he got a captain position. In Egypt, he found the wife of one of his officers attractive and had an affair with her. He sent the officer back to Europe and kept the wife in Egypt. Sounds similar to the Bible story of King David, Bathsheba, and Uriah, without the murder part, of course. He had 21 known mistresses in his lifetime. Later, he crowned himself as Emperor of France. These are just a few of the long list of similar behaviors that illustrate his doing as he pleased. In reference to the verse that this king would exalt and magnify himself above every god, first a few key points, then some quotes by Napoleon that will illustrate this. Napoleon was an Enlightenment skeptic, as one biographer described him. Remember that the Age of Enlightenment spanned from about the 1620s through the 1780s in Western Europe, and some of the founders of the colonies and then the United States of America, which emphasized intellectualism and an age of reason. Many adherents rejected religion, but many were deists who still considered there to be a God, a remote God. They emphasized individualism rather than following traditional religion, politics, and practices. This philosophy challenged the authority of the Church and sought reforms to society and government, although to have called Napoleon merely a skeptic may have been an understatement. He did not believe in the divinity of Jesus. Napoleon supported the National Assembly's civil constitution of the clergy that placed the clergy under government control. To illustrate his attitudes on various topics, here are some quotes of Napoleon. Most, not all, of these quotes are from the website brainyquote.com. First, we'll start with some of his views of religion. Quote, "If I had to choose a religion, the sun, that's S-U-N, as the universal giver of life would be my God. Then religion is what keeps the poor from murdering the rich. Then there's all religions have been made by men." End quotes. Then there is this quote combining his view of religion and his megalomania from the book Napoleon, A Life by Andrew Roberts, page 197, on Napoleon's dream of becoming a second Alexander the Great. Quote, "I would found a religion. I saw myself marching to Asia, mounted on an elephant, a turban on my head, and in my hand a new Koran that I would have composed to suit my needs." End quote. His belief that all religions are made by men is reflected in this quote too, since he thought himself capable of writings equivalent to not only the Quran, but then the Jewish and Christian scriptures as well. Therefore he set himself up as a god and a prophet. Napoleon did believe religion was useful as a social utility. From this quote of Napoleon, quote, "The idea of God is very useful to maintain good order, to keep men in the path of virtue, and to keep them from crime." End quote. A note on that. His army apparently did not have an idea of God because they committed many crimes, such as murder, rape, and looting. And I say murder as opposed to killing, which is what all armies do in warfare. Many innocent people, not just soldiers, were murdered, some at the direct command of Napoleon. These are some other quotes of his that give a clear picture that he thought he was the epitome of abilities and worthiness of great position in the world. He said, "I am the successor, not of Louis XVI, but of Charlemagne. Power is my mistress. I have worked too hard at her conquest to allow anyone to take her away from me. And I can no longer obey. I have tasted command, and I cannot give it up." If you wish to be a success in the world, promise everything, deliver nothing. The army is the true nobility of our country. End quote. Again, somewhat self-aggrandizing too, since he was the head of the army. Then there's this quote, "I made all my generals out of mud." End quote. This could be a reference to God's making of Adam. In the Jewish Torah, it describes Adam as being made out of mud, also in the Quran. Napoleon was, therefore, kind of comparing himself equal to God in the sense he was creating something out of mud. And here are some of his other quotes about his attitude toward women. Quote, "Being educated together, which is so good for men, especially for teaching them to help each other and preparing them by comradeship for the battle of life, is a school of corruption for women." End quote. And, quote, "Men are made for the full glare of life. Women are made for the seclusion of family life and to live at home." End quote. And note that Napoleon's reforms of government education did not include girls at all. There is no other conclusion. He definitely meets the test of being the megalomaniac described in Daniel's verses. Now the verse wherein Daniel states, "He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place." End quote. This must be God's wrath, since the verse states, "What has been determined must take place." But why would God be wrathful? And wrath against who? The Bible gives some actions of humanity that had prompted God to be wrathful. Our human propensity to worship idols, that is well illustrated in the story of Elijah and the pagan priests. I'll be telling you more about that later. And remember, idols are not just stone or wood figures and such that are worshipped, but also includes the worship of money and other worldly things. Also disobeying God's laws, mocking the messengers of God, rejecting his word and scoffing at his prophets, and profaning the Sabbath. Then there is this from Zephaniah chapter 1, verses 14 through 16 about the day of wrath as being something very specific. Quote, "The great day of the Lord is near, it is near and hasteth greatly, even the voice of the day of the Lord, wherein the mighty man crieth bitterly. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of the horn and alarm against the fortified cities and against the high towers." End quote. That day is a day of wrath, is a day of the Lord, meaning the appearance of the Messiah. And note that whenever the Messiah is to appear in both the first and second advents, meaning Jesus, and the Messiah of the latter days, Baha'u'llah, that period of time is a time of God's wrath. The symptoms of the day of wrath due to the coming of the Messiah are, as mentioned, a day or a time of trouble and distress, spiritual desolation, darkness, and gloom, symbolized by references elsewhere in the Bible to darkness and clouds. So talking about the Messiah coming on clouds, this is what basically they're talking about, this kind of cloud. This all ties into the vision in chapter 11 of Daniel about this king who exalts himself. The appearance of this king, Napoleon, is the sign of the times that the appearance of the Messiah is at hand. Verse 37, quote, "He will show no regard for the gods of his ancestors, or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but will exalt himself above them all." End quote. The comment about this king showing no regard for the gods of his ancestors is an extension of what has already been said. But let's zero in on the phrase, "the one desired by women." Another of the quotes of Napoleon will actually help us identify the one desired by women mentioned in Daniel. Quote from Napoleon, "Fighting is a soldier's religion. I never changed that. The other religion is the affair of women and priests. As for me, I always adopt the religion of the country I am in." End quote. The quote is from Betsy Balcom in the book To Befriend an Emperor, referenced in another book, Napoleon, A Life, by Andrew Roberts, page 174. His saying that he always adopts the religion of the country he's in is saying that he just uses religion as a way to control the people in those countries. He's using religion in a calculated way, not believing in it. So the identity of the one desired by women from the verse is Jesus Christ. That quote from Napoleon clarifies the meaning of the prophecy in Daniel in reference to that phrase, "the one desired by women," a phrase that was nonsensical until the advent of Jesus and the times in which Napoleon lived. The reason Jesus was desired by women is that he elevated the station of women by prohibiting divorce, which in general would protect a woman from being cast off without resources. The elevation of the station of Mary, mother of Jesus, was also a part of this. Concerning the phrase that this king would have no regard for any god, Napoleon, the king who exalted himself, rejected Jesus as the Messiah of the first advent, God's representative on earth, and per Daniel, this king would not regard any god except himself, thus exalting himself above all. And from his previous quotes, he apparently equated himself to a god. Remember his stating he made his generals out of mud? Verse 38, quote, "Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his ancestors he will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts." As to the phrase, "will honor a god of fortresses," military adventurism was Napoleon's god. His ideology relied upon might makes right. His ideas of reform for his conquered territories, including France, were autocratic and dictatorial, although he paid some lip service to the ideals of the French Revolution, meaning equality and fraternity. Now, Napoleon invaded a Muslim country. It is interesting to note, regarding this phrase about honoring a god of fortresses, that the Islamic world commonly had fortresses. This excerpt from the Encyclopedia of Islam, Volume 3, mentions this, quote, "The fortress is a common form of defensive building across the Islamic world. These military structures are found in rural areas and may be distinguished from urban defensive features, including citadels that acted as centers of government, market structures, or khans, and fortified perimeter walls. The term used most commonly in Arabic is kala, but kasr or hisan are also used. Persian uses daz or diz, and Turkish kale or hisar. Fortresses and castles were not exclusively military in nature. Many also had administrative and commercial roles." End quote. When Napoleon invaded Egypt and on up into Palestine, he encountered some of these Islamic and even pre-Islamic fortresses. Here are some of them: Alexandria, Cairo, El Arish, and of course Acre, the main focus of our story. In regards to this king honoring a god unknown to his ancestors, this is a reference to Islam primarily because they were in control of the beautiful land. We'll learn more about the beautiful land later in the verses, but remember that the beautiful land term is Daniel's name for the ancient Jewish homeland that we now know as Palestine or Israel. But when Daniel had this vision, neither Christianity nor Islam yet existed. Remember the man who revealed this vision to Daniel, who we know was the Bab. In revealing this vision to Daniel, he knew that this future king who exalts himself would come from a future Christian country, France, and be waging battles in an Islamic territory, that is Egypt and Palestine, of the late 1700s, and is conveying to Daniel and the people who would read this prophecy that this king would come in a distant future when these two new gods, other than the Jewish God of Daniel, would then exist. But no need to get hung up on this, and especially don't think that this is somehow trashing of Islam because the king who exalted himself, Napoleon, conquered an Islamic land. The vision is trying to convey to the people in the future, after Daniel, that this king would honor a god unknown to his ancestors. It wasn't quite easy, I'm sure, to explain that there would be two other major religions in the future, perhaps three if you include Zoroastrianism, that would affect this area of the world. So basically, I think that was mentioning would not be of Daniel's faith, Judaism, that this king who exalted himself would come from or deal with. Note that our new Messiah of the latter days, Baha'u'llah, teaches us that Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and Zoroastrians, and all the other followers of the other great monotheistic faiths on earth all worship the one and only God, the same God. There are always followers of the faiths of God that fail to follow all his laws. Don't judge faiths by their followers, but rather by the pure, unadulterated teachings of their founders. Nothing stated in this video or any of my other videos should be taken as a condemnation of any of the prophets of God and their faiths, although some of their followers do some awful things in the name of their faiths, unfortunately. If you'd like to learn something more about this Baha'u'llah that I've mentioned as being the Messiah of the latter days, this 30-minute video, The Prisoner of Akka, will be perfect for you. Just 30 minutes. You can stop the video here and write down this address to locate that video. When you write it down, note that the address starts with https:. Don't forget the S. So it's not just http:. And it is professionally made and narrated, and it's quite good. Then there's the phrase in that verse, quote, "He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts," end quote. The god of the military that Napoleon worshipped gave him the fruits of conquest, meaning tribute paid to him by the conquered peoples, such as precious metals, gems, artwork, and antiquities that he stole, especially the antiquities of Egypt. He was especially generous to his relatives and friends, such as by giving them kingships of several countries or provinces. He made his brother Joseph the king of Naples, brother Louis was made king of Holland, Jerome was made king of Westphalia, and he designated his son Napoleon Francois Joseph Charles on his birth as king of Rome. Napoleon gave artwork, precious gems, and antiquities that he stole from all the countries he conquered to the museum in Paris that would later become known as the Louvre. You can go to the website shown on this slide to see these items. Once you get to the Louvre website, look for the section just on the Napoleon collection 1769 through 1821 to see much of the collection. Verse 39, quote, "He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god, and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people, and will distribute the land at a price." Most of the mightiest fortresses that Napoleon encountered were in Egypt and Palestine, as mentioned previously concerning the prevalence of fortresses in Islamic lands. To the right is the fortress city of Acre, or Akka, as an example. And of course, in this verse, we also had a mention of foreign gods, and here it was with the help of a foreign god. Well, this comment could apply to all the fortresses in Europe, in Egypt, and in Palestine, since the gods of Christianity and Islam were both foreign to Daniel when he received these visions. Next, the phrase, quote, "will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people, and will distribute the land at a price," end quote. The part about making some of them rulers over many people is fairly specific. Did Napoleon do that? Napoleon was prolific in handing out goodies to his family, military officers, and government leaders. Some have already been mentioned. In 1806, Napoleon, quote, "began doling out titles and lands to the leaders of his empire," end quote. And that quote is from the book Napoleon, A Life by Andrew Roberts. And these are some examples. Marshal Joachim Murat was made Grand Duke of Berg. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand was made Prince of Benevento. Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte was made Prince of Pontecorvo. And he made 3 other of his marshals princes, and more. Some of these provinces were completely made up, subdividing or renaming existing provinces. Another way that Napoleon honored those who acknowledged him was through giving awards to them. For instance, the award known as the French Legion of Honor was invented by Napoleon. Some critics did not like such awards. They complained that Napoleon's use of medals as rewards was counter to the French Revolution's ideology of equality. Verse 40, quote, "At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and will sweep through them like a flood," end quote. That first phrase we've seen before, at, quote, "at the time of the end," end quote. It is just pointing out that we are speaking of the time of the end, meaning the latter days, the end times, etc. and that the Messiah will soon appear after this sign of the times, meaning the fulfillment of this prophecy. Now, regarding the kings of the north and south, the verse mentions the king of the north and the king of the south as battling the king who exalts himself. And it specifies that chariots, cavalry, and ships will be used. Now, remember this map of King Nebuchadnezzar's Neo-Babylonian Empire? That's the darker shaded blue here. We learned that Daniel's prophecies are all to be fulfilled within the territories that were formerly a part of Nebuchadnezzar's empire. So the prophecies in chapter 11 regarding the kings of the north and south and the king who exalted himself are pointing to this area. The area of that empire that Napoleon invaded during his invasion of Palestine, the land of ancient Israel and Judah, was in what Daniel refers to as the beautiful land, the land of the Jews before Nebuchadnezzar invaded and took some of them off to Babylon. These places that Napoleon battled, the forces of the Mamluks and the Ottomans, started in El Arish. There is a fortress there that Napoleon captured. It's located in the southwest part of the Babylonian Empire. Then Napoleon followed the coast up to Gaza, then up to Jaffa, and finally up to the strong city of Akka. A strong city is also called a fortress city or a walled city in the Bible. The area in the red circle is the beautiful land, Daniel's homeland. The kings of the north and south are determined to be that by whether they originate to the north or to the south of the beautiful land. That's simple enough. So, in reference to the time and events of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, the Mamluks, the rulers of Egypt, were the south, and the Ottomans, based in Turkey, were the north. Also note, Britain also was involved in fighting Napoleon in the beautiful land, in cahoots with the Ottomans to some extent. They didn't care so much for helping the Ottomans as just plain stopping Napoleon, because they were fighting a war in Europe as well with France. Note that Britain is also north of the beautiful land. So who was the king of the south that Napoleon had to deal with? Well, the south is Egypt, and the rulers of Egypt were the Mamluks. In Arabic it means property or owned slave. A little history here. Originally the Mamluks were warrior slaves brought in from the Caucasus and Balkan regions to serve in the armed forces, primarily known in Egypt, but also throughout the Islamic Middle East into India. The Mamluks then were warrior slaves. The practice of bringing in young men from these lands began around the 9th century through the 19th century. They were educated in Islam and became warrior slaves for the Islamic empires they served. The Fatimids of Egypt were brought in as warrior slaves from the Sudan, and some people believe that is the ancient land of Kush, by the way. Mamluks eventually became the ruling class in Egypt, although technically still in the Ottoman Empire under the Ottoman Sultan, but they were quite independent of them in reality. At the time of Napoleon, the rulers of Egypt were actually co-rulers. Ibrahim Bey, who was the administrative chief, and Murad Bey Muhammad, who was the chief of the army. By the way, Bey means chieftain. Bey is not their last names. They were more powerful than the Ottoman designated governor of Egypt. I already mentioned the fact that the word Bey is actually a Turkish title that means chieftain, but there's another title that you may run into, and that is the term Pasha, which is typical in the Ottoman Empire. The term Pasha at the end of a given name is not the person's family name, but rather it's his title. It is a Turkish word for a military or a political leader, such as a general in the army or a governor of a province or state within the empire, or other governmental leader. Some examples, we mentioned Murad Bey, who was the chief of the Egyptian army, as well as co-ruler of Egypt. And Pashas include the Pasha of Acre that Napoleon battled, Ahmed Djezzar Pasha. So Murad Bey was the king of the south, since he was a ruler of Egypt and head of the army who led the armed forces against Napoleon's land forces. Note that the forces of the Mamluks were assisted by the British Navy at one point, although not a coordinated effort apparently. The assistance to the King of the South by the British Navy was not planned, as mentioned. British Admiral Horatio Nelson had been seeking the French fleet for some time. When he discovered the French fleet in Aboukir Bay, he immediately began a battle to destroy them. There was no known collusion between the Egyptian rulers and Admiral Nelson. But Admiral Nelson's actions greatly assisted the kings of both the South and the North, because Nelson cut off Napoleon from supplies and reinforcements of the French troops. This restriction of resources ultimately held Napoleon back from further attempts to conquest beyond Acre. Admiral Nelson met the French fleet in Aboukir Bay on August 1st through the 3rd in 1798. Nelson was victorious over French Admiral Brueys' French fleet. The painting shown on the right is by George Arnold. The painting is located in the National Maritime Museum in England, and the image is from Wikipedia. Some of the major military actions in Egypt are listed here. Note that the Mamluk forces included Libyans, Sudanese, and Arabs as well. And here are some of those battles. Battle for Alexandria was July 2nd, 1798. The Battle of the Pyramids, July 21st. Cairo fell to Napoleon on July 24th. There was an uprising in Cairo in October 1798 that was quashed. And in February 1799, that's when the march to Syria began. Now you have to understand that Palestine area, what we call Palestine, was considered part of Syria. So I believe Napoleon's intent was to go all the way to Damascus and maybe beyond, but he only got as far as Acre. As a result of Napoleon's successful military campaign in Egypt, the Mamluks and their armies were pushed out of Egypt into the beautiful land. The Ottomans became riled up with the retreat of the Mamluks from Egypt into the Sinai Peninsula and Palestine. The Ottomans became concerned about Napoleon's expressed aim to invade and conquer Syria. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and his leaders prepared to attack Napoleon under Djezzar Pasha's lead. Napoleon became alarmed at this massing of Ottoman and Mamluk forces. Napoleon then threatened Djezzar Pasha that if he did not stop harboring the Mamluks in Palestine, Napoleon would attack Acre, which was Djezzar Pasha's base. The Ottoman forces included Turks and Syrians, Mamluk forces including Arab irregulars, soldiers from Libya, Algiers, Sudan, Morocco, and Senegal areas, and some from the Balkans including Albanians and Greeks. And remember that quote from Daniel, "And the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships." End quote. This phrase truly reflects the response from the Ottoman Sultan and the British forces as they combined to defeat Napoleon in Acre. Now, about their storming out, the Sultan's, the king of the north, his forces were amassing in Damascus as Napoleon was headed to Acre. Now, the story of the siege of Acre will follow shortly. These forces stormed out to meet Napoleon's General Kleber's army at Mount Hammurabi, although the battle is known as the Battle of Mount Tabor. Napoleon had left the area of Acre with some troops who arrived at that battle to help Kleber's troops. Their combined forces scattered the Ottoman forces. This map shows the proximity of Mount Tabor to Acre or Akka, Damascus in the north, and Nazareth, where Napoleon spent the night after the battle. This Battle of Mount Tabor is about the furthest inland that Napoleon's forces ventured in the whole campaign. So who was the King of the North in our story of the prophecy here? Ahmad Jazer Pasha, the governor of Acre and the surrounding area of Palestine, qualifies as the King of the North. Note that his name means the butcher because of his ruthlessness. For instance, he ordered the killing of several hundred Christians and had their bodies put into bags and thrown into the Mediterranean. Napoleon's troops found many of them and opened the bags to see their gruesome contents. One of those found in the bags was one of the message bearers that Napoleon had sent to Jazer. The British assisted Jazer and his troops in defending the city of Acre. British participation was crucial. There was an Anglo-Russo-Turkish alliance against France at the time. The British were determined to provide a defeat for Napoleon at Acre. British Commodore Sidney Smith's military engineer and émigré to England, Antoine de Philippeaux, assisted Acre's defenses by reinforcing walls, mounting cannons on top of walls at strategic locations, among other military improvements. There are 3 other candidates for the King of the North position. All 4 of them could be true. Commodore Smith also placed his ships in positions to provide artillery bombardment of French troops attacking Acre. Some military experts attribute Napoleon's defeat at Acre to the British assistance, providing artillery on the walls of the city as well as bombardment from the ships in the harbor. So could the British Commodore Smith be the King of the North? Then there are the 2 bosses of the Pasha and the British Commodore who could be the King of the North. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was Selim III. He was the Pasha's regent and boss. And the King of England was King George III, the boss of Commodore Smith. Here are some images of those 2 actual kings who could be the King of the North, Sultan Selim III and King George III. Or perhaps they both were the King of the North in a sense. Let's look at another one of the phrases from Daniel's verses. Quote, "He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood." End quote. Napoleon fought 60 battles in his career, winning most of them. His forces fought battles throughout Europe, including Spain, Italy, Austria, Germany, Poland, and Russia, and of course Egypt and the Beautiful Land. His military philosophy included swift attacks similar to Alexander the Great, one of his heroes. So Napoleon and the circumstances of his Syrian adventure and military career as a whole fulfilled this prophecy. Verse 41, quote, "He will also invade the beautiful land. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand." End quote. Regarding this phrase from verse 41, he will also invade the beautiful land, Palestine, ancient Israel, as we know it. Many countries will fall. Well, we already know that Napoleon fulfills these prophecies. And the next part of the verse, quote, "But Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered." End quote. Well, Edom, Moab, and Ammon remained untouched by Napoleon and his forces when he invaded the beautiful land. The map on the left side of the screen is of the beautiful land around the year 830 BC, when those kingdoms of Edom, Moab, and Ammon existed. Those 3 kingdoms are circled by the heavy red line. Now the map I've inserted here on the right is the one you've seen before that depicts the path of Napoleon's forces that they took when they invaded Palestine. The red arrows show their path along the coast, pretty much the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, or close to it, from Egypt up to Acre on the top of the map. And then the green arrows show their retreat. And as I said before, the furthest inland they got is up near Haifa. Acre was to the Nazareth area, Mount Tabor. You can see that they completely skipped. If you compare that map to the map on the left, you can see that they completely skipped those three kingdoms, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, just as it was prophesied that he would. Verse 42, quote, "He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape," end quote. We all now know, indeed, that this verse has been fulfilled by Napoleon. Verse 43, quote, "He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Cushites in submission," end quote. Concerning the part of the verse, quote, "He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt," end quote, the fact that Napoleon carted off the treasures of Egypt, from antiquities to precious metals and gems to the Rosetta Stone, was covered already. Thus, this verse too has been fulfilled by Napoleon. Now, as to that clause, quote, "with the Libyans and Cushites in submission," end quote, the forces of the Mamluk rulers in Egypt that fought and lost to Napoleon included a hodgepodge of races and ethnicity, including Libyans, Algerians, Moroccans from northern Africa, Arabs. Again, some people think that the entity called Cush was in the Arabian Peninsula. This coalition included Nubians and Ethiopians, and now some other people think that Cush was in that location, Ethiopia or the Sudan area. And the coalition even included Albanians and Greeks from the Balkans, among others. Thus, Napoleon's victories over the Mamluks of Egypt meant that soldiers from the areas of Libya and Cush submitted to this king who exalts himself. Thus, this verse 43 in its entirety about Egypt was fulfilled by Napoleon. Verse 44, quote, "But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in great rage to destroy and annihilate many," end quote. It is obvious that these last few verses are about Egypt and the beautiful land invasions by Napoleon. As to the phrase, quote, "reports from the east and the north will alarm him," end quote, well, the reports from the north could have been north as in news from Europe. While Napoleon was in Egypt, he did learn that there were reports that France's armies were in serious trouble defending France. And or it could be north as in news that the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was preparing to invade Egypt. And further, regarding the reports from the east that would alarm him, from the east could be the news coming from the Sinai that the Mamluks were preparing with the Ottomans for an invasion of Egypt to throw the French out of Egypt. There were several documented sources of the bad news that Napoleon received that alarmed him. Hamelin, a French merchant who arrived from Trieste a few days before his departure from Cairo for Syria, is one of those sources that was documented. The news was that the renewal of the war in Italy, the Russo-Turkish blockade of Corfu, and declaration of war by Turkey against European powers was imminent. And that is from the document I, Daniel, by Robert Riggs. This is information he gleaned from a book called Bonaparte in Egypt by J. Christopher Harold on page 221. And another quote on as a source of bad news that Napoleon received. And this quote is from the book Napoleon: A Life by Andrew Roberts, page 181. And the quote is, "On October 20th, Napoleon learned that a Turkish army was gathering in Syria to attack him." End quote. And yet another source of this bad news that Napoleon had is also from the book Napoleon: A Life by Andrew Roberts, and this is from page 196. Quote, "Easily, British Commodore Smith's finest piece of psychological warfare, however, was neither disinformation nor misinformation, but simply supplying Napoleon with true information. Under a flag of truce, he, the Commodore, sent over several editions of recent British and European newspapers, from which Napoleon was able to piece together the series of disasters that had recently overtaken French arms that's in the European battles." End quote. Documentation of this news that alarmed Napoleon are in these books on this slide. You can pause this video if you want to write down this information for further research. Thus, events in Napoleon's Egyptian and Palestine campaign, pertinent to this verse, quote, "reports from the east and the north will alarm him," end quote, fulfilled this prophecy. Then there's the part of the verse, quote, "he will set out in great rage to destroy and annihilate many," end quote. One of Napoleon's generals advised that French forces remain in Egypt by the Sinai border and wait for the Ottoman and Mamluk forces to come to them rather than invade 300 miles into Palestine, having to cross desert terrain to do so, too. Napoleon, in his fevered desire to destroy the enemy forces, determinedly chose to pursue this invasion of the Sinai and Palestine areas instead of just waiting for them to come to him. You've actually seen this map before. This map shows the routes that Napoleon took up from Egypt, starting at El Arish in the Sinai, up through first El Arish, where the Mamluk forces there were overcome, and note the red arrows showing how they entered into this area. Then up to Gaza, which was number 2, then Jaffa, number 3, and then up to Acre, that's number 4 at the very top of the map. And again, the retreat was along the same route as the green arrows show, the retreat. Now, concerning this prophecy of destruction and annihilation, we'll begin with number 1 there, the Fort El Arish. And it was... the battle was February 17th through 19th of the year 1799. The fort was defended by 2,000 Turkish troops and their Arab allies. Napoleon bombarded the fort until the walls were finally breached, and then he demanded surrender, which they did. The men swore they would not join Djezzar's forces if they could keep their weapons. Now, Napoleon agreed to the conditions, yet after they surrendered, the French reneged and disarmed them. This doesn't sound so bad, right? Napoleon's troops may have destroyed the fort, but what about the annihilation part, you may be wondering. After Napoleon's forces conquered El Arish, they continued north to the second major battle, and that was on February 25th, 1799. They went to Gaza, and there they chased the Mamluk forces out of Gaza. The French took their ammunition and other supplies that the Mamluks left behind. No annihilation here. Napoleon continues north to Jaffa, the number 3 on that map. The siege begins at noon on March 3rd. Now, March 4th, Napoleon wrote a letter to the governor of Jaffa demanding his surrender, and he sent it via a messenger. The governor cut off the messenger's head and displayed it on the wall of the city. The French forces breached the walls, entered the city, and began to murder, rape, and pillage for 24 hours. On March 9th and 10th, 3,000 captured fighters at Jaffa were taken to a beach about 1 mile from Jaffa and massacred in cold blood. This was done by direct order of Napoleon, and that story is from that book, Napoleon, A Life, page 189. So now we definitely have destruction and annihilation going on. Also at Jaffa, numerous young women were kidnapped and taken to the French camp where they were raped. Napoleon heard of this and had the women gathered into a hospital courtyard. Napoleon gave the order to execute them. His order was followed. Definitely more annihilation here, and definitely fulfillment of that part of the prophecy. Next on Napoleon's agenda was the siege of Acre, which was a 9-week siege that took place between March 19th and May 20th of 1799. Now, while the French army was in Jaffa, they were exposed to the plague, resulting in many illnesses and death. 95% of those who became ill died, and that was about 2,000 deaths in all. The Mamluks, of course, also suffered from the plague. Now, French army estimates of casualties were about 2,300 killed and almost that many, 2,200 wounded or ill. The Ottomans and Allies suffered unknown numbers of killed and wounded, but probably in the multiple thousands. We should also add in the results of the Battle of Mount Tabor too. This battle was fought to stop the Ottoman troops from coming south out of Damascus. The Ottomans suffered around 6,000 killed, and supposedly Napoleon's troops suffered only 2 killed and 60 wounded. But you should note, and I think it's been mentioned before, that Napoleon was a consistent liar when it came to reporting the number of French casualties. My conclusion, that there is no doubt Napoleon was directly responsible for great destruction and annihilation. Thus, this part of the prophecy, and now all of verse 44, has been fulfilled by Napoleon as the king who exalted himself. Onward to verse 45, and note that this is the last verse in chapter 11. Quote, "He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him." End quote. The fulfillment of this last verse by events surrounding Napoleon's attack on Acre are truly amazing. First, let's clarify which mountain in Palestine, or Israel, is the beautiful holy mountain mentioned by Daniel in chapter 11. It is Mount Carmel, which is located along the Mediterranean Sea in northern Israel, then called Palestine. The name is from the Hebrew name Carmel, which means in English the vineyard of a god. Mount Carmel was the mountain where Elijah challenged the idol-worshipping priests to prove that Elijah's one and only invisible God was more powerful than their idol gods. See 1 Kings chapter 18 and the following explanation for more details about Mount Carmel as a holy mountain. If you are unfamiliar with the story of Elijah and or doubt that Mount Carmel is a holy mountain, I thought a review of the story is in order. It is from 1 Kings chapter 18. It's a story of the evil king Ahab and the priests of Baal and Asherah, two of the more prevalent idols at the time. Now these are versus Elijah the prophet and his God. The events took place on Mount Carmel. After reviewing the story of Elijah, I'll give additional reasons why we should consider Mount Carmel to be this holy mountain of chapter 11 of Daniel. To help clarify a bit, here are some of the images of some people's ideas of how the idol god Baal may have been rendered in this culture in ancient Israel. Those are the two on the left. Most of the time, Baal is depicted as having the head of a bull. Sometimes the entire body of Baal is depicted as a bull. Then on the far right is a figure of the idol god Asherah that was found in the area in archaeological digs. Some seem to have wanted a female god to worship, so they came up with the idea of God having a wife named Asherah. At the time of the prophet Elijah, Ahab was king of Israel. Under him, the Israelites rejected the covenant with God. They tore down altars to God and put his prophets to death with the sword. Hundreds of priests of the idols Baal and Asherah held sway over the people of Israel, displeasing God. Elijah, God's prophet, challenged King Ahab to have all the priests of Baal and Asherah come to Mount Carmel to test their gods versus Elijah's one God. So King Ahab summoned the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. This is from 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 19. And from verses 20 and 21, quote, "So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, 'How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him.' But the people said nothing." End quote. The photo on the right is Mount Carmel around 1894 Common Era. It would have looked very much the same when Napoleon was there. Elijah was the only prophet of God left against the 850 priests of the idol worshippers. Elijah set up a contest between him and those 850 idol worshipping priests to determine which god or gods were true. Two bulls were placed on separate altars on wood bases. Now, Elijah did not construct his altar until after the idol worshippers had made their case. The idol priests were instructed to cut up the bull, place the pieces on the wood on their altar, but not set fire to them. The other bull was placed on Elijah's altar to his God, the God of the Jews. The bulls were not set on fire. Then Elijah instructed, quote, "Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God." End quote. That's from 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 24. Again, the God who answers the pleas of his followers with fire. He is the true God. So the God must start the fire. This is an artistic depiction of the idol-worshipping priests as they called upon their gods to answer their pleas by sending fire down upon their sacrificial animal, the bull placed on the wood platform of the altar. Then from verse 25, quote, "Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. 'Baal, answer us,' they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered, and they danced around the altar they had made." End quote. The idol priests got no response at all from their gods. Elijah taunted them, perhaps gleefully. The priests then shouted louder, slashed themselves until blood flowed. They continued frantically, but in the end, no response from their idol gods. Then Elijah took his turn. Elijah called the people over to his altar, to his God. He and the people built their altar to their Lord. The 12 stones of Elijah's stone altar represented the 12 tribes of Israel. Elijah had the people pour the water over the offerings 3 times. This is someone's artistic depiction of Elijah's altar being prepared for the contest between Elijah and the idolatrous priests and their gods. This image is from the website that you see at the bottom of the slide, by the way. This is Elijah's altar to his God of the Jews. He ordered that a trench be dug around the altar, grain put in that trench as an offering. The animal sacrifice, the bull, was cut up in pieces and put on top of the wood platform on top of the stone altar. Then 4 large pitchers of water were poured over the meat and grain offerings, drenched 3 times, all according to Elijah's specific instructions. 1 Kings chapter 18 verses 36 and 37, quote, Elijah prayed to his Lord, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. End quote. At that time, after Elijah's prayer to God, the fire of the Lord hit and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, along with the water in the trench. The people were amazed and cried out to God, The Lord, He is God, the Lord, He is God. A depiction of Elijah's success in getting God to display some of his power to the idol priests, those who followed them, and the Israelites. So the bottom line is, Mount Carmel is indeed a holy mountain and the vineyard of God. Remember, verse 19 stated that the contest was held on Mount Carmel. It is a holy mountain upon which the God of the Jews, Christians, Muslims, Baha'is, and others spoke most fiercely. Now a little bit more about how Napoleon fulfilled this sentence in verse 45. Quote, He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. End quote. It is well documented that Napoleon spent some time on Mount Carmel. This is one example, and it's from the book Bonaparte in Egypt by J. Christopher Harold, page 284, that on March 17, 1799, quote, Bonaparte had his troops occupy Haifa and set up headquarters on Mount Carmel, from where he could overlook the entire lovely bay. End quote. Another example, a quote from the book Napoleon, A Life by Andrew Roberts, page 193, quote, Napoleon was forced to watch in horror from the cliffs above Haifa, meaning on top of Mount Carmel, as his flotilla of 9 vessels under Commodore Pierre-Jean Standelet, carrying his entire siege artillery and equipment, rounded the Mount Carmel promontory straight into the clutches of HMS Tigre and HMS Theseus. You may be wondering about that clause in the verse about the king who exalted himself that he would, quote, pitch his royal tents between the seas at the holy mountain, end quote. And you may be asking, since Napoleon pitched his royal tent on Mount Carmel by setting up his headquarters there, was it located between the seas? This is a map of the beautiful land, and note the arrow pointing to where Mount Carmel is located. Also note that there are 2 seas, inland seas. One's called the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Kinneret, and below that the Dead Sea, or the Sea of Arabah, from the ancient past. And the area circled in purple would be any area in that circle would be between the seas, thus. Therefore, Mount Carmel, being between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sea of Galilee specifically, would qualify here as meeting the verse 45 in Daniel as being the holy mountain between the seas. Thus Napoleon fulfilled this part of verse 45 as well, that he pitched his royal tents between the seas at the holy mountain. Now on to that last sentence of chapter 11 of the book of Daniel, quote, Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him, end quote. Now that the man has revealed to Daniel, in the vision that started in chapter 10, The important parts of the prophecy of the king who exalts himself, the things this king did that will indicate to readers the signs of the times to watch for to tell us when the Messiah's appearance is nigh. The man in the vision quickly wraps up the vision and Napoleon's life by this simple statement, meaning he'll come to an end with no one to help him. Kind of sad in a way, but the life of Napoleon was important to God and the man revealing this vision, and thus to us, so that we might be able to identify the Messiah of the latter days with the help of Daniel's prophecies. This timeline shows Napoleon's time from 1815 to 1819. On the left are shown his escape from Elba, return to Paris, his massive defeat by the British at Waterloo, then his second and last exile to St. Helena. These happenings in Napoleon's life from the late 1700s up to the end of 1815 all fit into Daniel chapter 11 verses 36 to 45, except that very last sentence. Note, about 2 years after Napoleon was exiled the second time and last time, the Messiah was born in Persia. Baha'u'llah was born on November 12, 1817. That is noted in the green box on the right side of this timeline. This timeline picks up in 1819, where you will note on the left that the Bab, the Elijah figure of the Messiah's appearance, was born on October 20th, 1819 in Persia. Then that very last sentence in verse 45 about the king who exalts himself, that he will come to his end with no one to help him, is fulfilled when Napoleon dies an excruciating death from stomach cancer on May 5th, 1821, just a bit short of his 52nd birthday. Thus, Napoleon's death in exile at St. Helena, very much alone with no hope of survival of stomach cancer, very much meets this verse, yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. Count that as fulfilled. Mount Carmel is a holy mountain to the Baha'is of the world. This is the shrine of the Bab that is located on the side of Mount Carmel. The photo on the left is a daytime shot, obviously, and on the right is at night with the terraces lit up, which are quite beautiful. And the street scene below at the bottom of the mountain is Ben Gurion Avenue that's all lit up. It should be noted that the world center of the Baha'i faith, the buildings of the administrative order of the Baha'is of the world, is also located on Mount Carmel. Also, Akka, or Akar, also has a very spiritually significant meaning to Baha'is. Baha'u'llah, the Messiah of the latter days, was exiled to Akka in 1868 by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire purely because of his proclaiming that he was God's latest manifestation and that he had a large, adamant group of followers. He was imprisoned in the citadel within the walls of Akka for several years. Then he was confined to the city for many years thereafter. He was never allowed to leave the Akka-Haifa area for the remainder of his life. Baha'u'llah passed away in 1892 and is buried just outside of Akka. Baha'u'llah arrived at Akka in 1868 as a prisoner of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He arrived at this sea gate to enter Akka. This reminds me of this excerpt from Psalms 24, verses 9 and 10, announcing the arrival of the Messiah, the King of Glory, through "you ancient doors," exactly the scenario when Baha'u'llah arrived at Akka. Quote, "Lift up your heads, you gates. Lift them up, you ancient doors, that the King of Glory may come in. Who is he, this King of Glory? The Lord Almighty. He is the King of Glory." End quote. The sea gate to Akka was opened, and Baha'u'llah, the Messiah, the Lord of hosts, entered to become the prisoner of Akka. This is the shrine of Baha'u'llah, located just outside of Akar or Akka. It's the sanctuary of the earthly remains of Baha'u'llah. And this is a wider shot of the shrine of Baha'u'llah, taken at a distance, obviously. The small building just beyond the tree in the center of the photo is the sanctuary building you just saw in the previous photo. If you'd like to learn something more about this Baha'u'llah that I've mentioned as being the Messiah of the latter days, this 30-minute video, The Prisoner of Akka, will be perfect for you. Just 30 minutes. You can stop the video here and write down this address to locate that video. When you write it down, note that the address starts with https:. Don't forget the S. So it's not just http:. And it is professionally made and narrated, and it's quite good. In conclusion, to sum it all up, Napoleon fulfilled the prophecies in Daniel chapter 11 verses 36 to 45 inclusive, beyond any doubt. Thus the end of Napoleon's career as a king is an indicator of the imminent appearance of the Messiah of the latter days. That was the whole purpose of the second section of chapter 11 in Daniel, to be a time indicator. Baha'u'llah, who was the earthly presence of Michael, Daniel's prince, his being born just 2 years before the death of Napoleon, came exactly as foretold. Back in chapter 10, the man in Daniel's vision stated to Daniel, quote, "But first I will tell you what is written in the book of truth," end quote. The fact that the prophecy of the king who exalts himself came true in every detail is proof of the validity of Daniel being a prophet of God, and his prophecies are true, and even that there is a God, and that there truly is a book of truth. It is only fair when looking at prophecy fulfillment that the complete picture of how, or if, all the prophecies of the Bible about the coming of the Messiah of the last days are claimed to have been fulfilled in view of the probabilities that they were fulfilled by chance alone, or by the design of certain parties. Can someone or a group of people collude in some way to manipulate things to give the appearance of prophecy fulfillment? Doubtful, in my mind. The probability of all these details of Napoleon and the verses of Daniel chapter 11 coming true, just as foretold, makes it impossibly unlikely that they could have all come true by chance alone or by the designs of other parties. If you are interested in Bible prophecy and the mathematics of those probabilities of fulfillment by chance alone and what that means, please see my 2-part video, Bible Prophecy and Mathematical Probabilities. In a few more slides you get directions how to access those videos on YouTube. This all leads up to this fact: the Elijah and the Messiah of the latter days have appeared, and they are the Bab and Baha'u'llah, respectively. These 2 websites may be helpful in finding correct information about the Baha'i faith, should you choose to investigate a little further. The top one, bahai.org, is the international website. It has free access to the sacred and authoritative writings of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdu'l-Baha. The bottom one, bahai.us, is the official USA website. Just a caution, as you search on the web for information about the Baha'i faith, there is a lot of misinformation out there, and in some cases there's actual disinformation, people who purposefully give incorrect information about the Baha'i faith. So just be thorough in your research, get multiple sources of information, including the Baha'is. Don't forget to talk to us, and just be careful. Please remember that the man continues his vision that he's given to Daniel in chapter 12. So please join me in video number 7, or part number 7, in this 8-part series on the book of Daniel. You can access the book of Daniel part 7 and my other videos on Bible prophecy fulfillment through YouTube. You go to YouTube, youtube.com, And in the search box you enter my channel name, as you see there, Integral Destiny 9, in the search box, and it should take you to find a whole bunch of my other videos. Here are some of the sources I used for, the top two there, Napoleon Life and Bonaparte in Egypt, are books that I used for background on Napoleon, the history of Napoleon. And the third one, I, Daniel, is a explanation of the book of Daniel by Mr. Robert Riggs. It's online and it's free. It's divided into two sections, each one having a separate website there. And that I, Daniel, is the source of my core information about the interpretation of Daniel that I elaborated on greatly in my videos. You should realize that this video is an amateur production by this person, me, alone. It is not an official production in any way, shape, or form, sponsored by, or in any way added to, deleted from by official Baha'i sources. They were not a part of this. If I made any errors, they are my errors alone. If you have some reason to contact me, there is my website there, my email address I should say, and this is actually copyright to 2016. And please do not modify these materials or use them for profit-making purposes. Thank you, and thank you for watching. Now go to Part 7, Book of Daniel, Part 7.